Good evening. You're nice and quiet, low mumbles. Now, I'm John Safran, just guy around town, and we have with us, very luckily and fortunately, we have Joshua Oppenheimer, filmmaker, maker of the two-part, like Godfather 1 and Godfather 2, because they're as good as each other, The Act of Killing and The Look of Silence.
Thank you.
And thanks for coming. Yes. And maybe so we can get a vibe of how much background Joshua should get across. Have a lot of you seen one, either or both of his films? Okay, we'll work all around the one no and bore senseless all the yeses. Maybe before we get into the film, let's...
Was it both?
Pardon?
I think he said both.
Oh, both. No. Okay, then let's not give any background whatsoever. Don't even mention Indonesia. So before we get into the films, maybe a bit about you. So are you the first filmmaker in your family? Or first artistic professional person? Like what did your parents do and your grandparents? And
my
stuff?
Sister's an artist. My sister's an artist. My grandmother, can you all hear me? This is fine? Okay. My grandmother was a painter. And I actually found out that one of my filmmaking heroes, well, two of my filmmaking heroes, Max Ophüls and his son Marcel Ophüls, were born Max Oppenheimer and Marcel Oppenheimer and changed their name because Oppenheimer is nothing to be proud of. And so maybe I'm distantly related to them. And I didn't expect to be a filmmaker. I went to university to study theoretical physics and cosmology, interested in really still the same questions that keep me awake today, which is sort of what are we? What is this mystery? Why is there something rather than nothing? And what does it mean to perceive? And how do we perceive? And how does storytelling and fiction and fantasy inflect or condition or shape how we perceive?
And why do you think you became interested in the storytelling of looking into killing and looking into genocide? Like, what was scratching around your brain growing up that made you think about all this?
I grew up in a family that had narrowly escaped the Holocaust, both in Germany and in Austria. My father's from Frankfurt, my father's mother from Berlin, my stepmother's parents from Vienna, and they all escaped just before it was too late. My grandmother as late as the end of 1938, when it really was too late for most people. And I very much grew up, and most of the extended family perished. And I grew up with the lesson at home that the aim of all politics, certainly, and my father's a political scientist and my mother a labor organizer, a union organizer and activist. I grew up with the message that the aim of all politics is to prevent these things from happening again, not in the narrow sense of never again to us, but in the sense of never again to anybody, anywhere. And that's certainly part of it, but I would like to think that that is not what led me to sort of answer the call that came to me at some point of addressing this history and its terrible legacy in the present, because a crime against humanity is, of course, defined as a crime against each and every one of us, all of our humanity. And so while I don't deny that my family's background was part of what led me to take this very seriously, and certainly when I saw the boastfulness of the perpetrators, when I encountered that in early 2003, 2004, it's probably what led me to have this thought that I'd wandered into Germany or someplace like Germany 40 years after the Holocaust, only to find the Nazis still in power if the rest of the world had celebrated the Holocaust while it took place, which of course accounts for the shamelessness of the perpetrators. Perhaps that does come from my background, but I would hope also that true to the notion of a crime against humanity and its demand that we practice the widest possible empathy and recognize that even if people are hurt very far away, it's ourselves being hurt. I would hope that I would have responded in the same way without this family background.
And when did you first realize that life and politics and events were kind of complicated and messy, and not necessarily the easy thing we're told at school when they tell us about history?
I think I was sort of raised with that notion to some extent, but when did I first realize that? I think that I don't have like for as long as I've
date.
a date.
Exactly.
No, I mean, I grew up, my father got me into a great deal of trouble at school, sending me to school with a badge that said question authority. And I was put into detention after school because I refused to take it off. And it got as far because Americans are terribly and absurdly litigious of, people threatening lawsuits around this little badge my father gave me. Actually, he gave me the badge, I now remember, when I lost a tooth. It was under my pillow. It was what left for me by the tooth fairy. And I remember putting my arm under the pillow and having actually it be, stabbed by the pin on the badge. So at least since then, I had the sense that most of what we're told is lies.
Socialist tooth fairy who doesn't leave money but leaves a badge.
Yeah.
And how did you? When did you first end up in Indonesia, and why?
So I went to Indonesia in 2001. I knew really nothing about Indonesia. I was asked to. I was just, in fact, my background as a filmmaker was in fiction, but in its wildest corners. My mentor is this filmmaker, Dusan Makaveyev, who made actually a film once in Australia called Coca-Cola Kid, but we'll skip over that one quickly and remember and honor his masterpieces, films like WR, Mysteries of the Organism, Innocence Unprotected, Sweet Movie, really some of the greatest works ever made in cinema. And he was combining fiction and documentary, but my training was in fiction. And then I discovered Jean Rouch, the filmmaker who actually coined the term cinema verite, but used it in a sense that was completely different from how we would talk about cinema verite in the English-speaking world.
How would you describe cinema verite?
Well, cinema verite is often this kind of fancy word for films that pretend to be shot as a kind of fly on the wall. And that's, of course, a nonsense in that we're never really a fly on the wall. People never forget the presence of the camera. And we're always collaborating with the people we film to create the situations we film, these occasions in which we're sort of rubbing reality against the grain and everybody is pushed beyond their comfort zone within the overall safe space of making a film. And I take that safety very, very importantly, despite the fact that we see uncomfortable and what sometimes even can be risky situations within my films. But Jean Rouch defined cinema verite in a completely different way. He had this, he would let people act out fictions, fantasies. And then he was filming some of his earliest films where he did this without sync sound, before there was Nagra portable synchronous sound. And then he would play back the silent rushes to the participants, the actors, the subjects, and they would make up, watching themselves in the mirror of the film, they would make up dialogue. And sometimes they would break character and they would say, hey, I look ridiculous, don't I? Or, aren't I handsome? And this would become the soundtrack of these films. And I was just discovering this and realized that cinema actually could be a kind of prism where you make visible the fictions and fantasies that make us who we are. This was in 2001, and I was living in London, and I started with my then collaborator, Christine Sin, a kind of workshop in the East End where I was trying to develop, where I was just discovering documentary, nonfiction film through this kind of road of looking for fiction within our nonfiction reality. And a friend got involved with that who asked if I would be interested in making a film, joining a project that would explore the violent underbelly of corporate-driven globalization, and it would involve teaching a group of agricultural workers somewhere in the world how to make their own film about their struggle to organize a union in the aftermath of a military dictatorship or totalitarian regime under which unions had been illegal. And and I said yes because I was just wanting an opportunity to explore nonfiction. And I was likely to go to a part of northeastern India that had been under martial law, and the second choice was Colombia. But in the end, I was sent to Indonesia, knowing nothing about the place. I found myself on a Belgian-owned oil palm plantation in North Sumatra, the same plantation where Ramli's family lives in The Look of Silence. And the Belgian company gave the women workers the supposedly lighter job of spraying the pesticides and the herbicides, and they would give them no protective clothing. And one of the herbicides, it turned out, was so toxic that the mist would go in their lungs, reach their bloodstream, reach their livers, and dissolve the fabric of their liver tissue, and the women workers would die of liver failure in their 40s. And in the 6 months I was there, 3 women that I was close to and were working on the film died, and more died afterwards. And one of the first things that they therefore tried to do as a union was to figure out what was causing this, and then to go to the company and demand protective clothing. And in response, the company hired Pancasila Youth, the paramilitary group at the center of the act of killing, to threaten and attack the workers. They dropped their demand immediately. And I said, how can you let this go? Isn't this, after all, a matter of life and death for you? And they said, it is. But you see, our parents and our grandparents were killed as part of a mass killing here in 1965, simply because they were members of the National Plantation Workers Union. And that alone meant that they were seen as likely opponents of the new military dictatorship. And we're afraid this could happen again, because Pancasila Youth was the main civilian paramilitary organization to kill with the army in this region. And they're still powerful, and we're too afraid to pursue this. So after the plantation workers made their film, they ended up making a film called The Globalization Tapes. They said to me, come back, and now why don't you make a film about why we're still afraid and what it's like for us to live today surrounded by the still powerful perpetrators. And I went back immediately in early 2003, and that's what led to The Act of Killing and The Look of Silence.
And yeah, it sounded like your hero filmmaker that you described before, sorry, I didn't remember his name,
Jean Rouge.
Yes, that he had an impact on. As soon as you explained that, I started thinking, oh, The Act of Killing. You're going in there and getting these people to play act.
Yeah, I think that people have said that my work is the opposite of cinema verite. I think it is truly cinema verite. And I see myself absolutely as standing on the shoulders of Rouge. Of course, The Act of Killing was the version that you would have seen here in Australia was the complete film. It was shortened for some markets where they couldn't release in cinemas a film of 2 hours and 40 minutes. It was 2 hours and 40 minutes cut from 1,200 hours of material, which in Jean Rouge's time would have required an airplane hangar, I suppose, just to hold the rushes.
And maybe explain for the few people who haven't seen The Act of Killing why it was interesting / made people edgy.
Well, I'm glad it made people edgy, because I think in our times that the purpose of art it ought to be to put us on edge. I think we're not on edge enough. But The Act of Killing, when I started working on when I returned to Indonesia in 2003, I started working with Adi and his family. And they started gathering survivors to tell me their stories. But in 3 weeks, the army stopped the survivors, threatened all of them not to participate, and then they said, try to film the perpetrators. And I thought that would be dangerous. I was coming up with all sorts of sort of neutral questions that I might ask to work my way around to 1965, like I'm interested in the history of your village, or what did you do for a living? But I found it was unnecessary. I found I would approach people, I would ask a question like that, and within seconds they would be recounting the most gruesome details of the 1965 genocide in this strangely boastful and performative way. And I had the feeling that that as I filmed more and more perpetrators doing this, and then brought them together, perpetrators who didn't know each other. And there's a scene in The Look of Silence where I did that for the first time. It's a scene where the 2 men take me down to the river, taking turns playing victim and perpetrator, demonstrating how they killed. I saw that they were boasting like this even for each other, that they were reading from a shared script, and that the boasting is obviously not madness or monstrosity, but impunity. And if there's monstrosity, it's political and collective. And I realized that I was getting performance rather than sober remembrance. And I started to propose to the perpetrators, trying to well, performance is always intended for an audience. And my question was, who is your imagined audience? How do you want to be seen? By whom? How do you want to see yourself? And so I started proposing to the perpetrators. I would say, look, you've participated in one of the biggest killings in human history. I want to know what it means to you and to your society. You want to show me what you've done. So go ahead and show me what you've done in whatever way you wish. I will film your dramatizations, but I will also film you and your fellow death squad veterans and protégés discussing how you want to be seen, what you want to show, what you want to leave out, and why. And in that sense, I'll be able to sort of answer this question: for whom are these men performing, and what are the consequences of this on the whole society? And eventually, I met the main character of the film, a man named Anwar Congo, who came from was one of the perpetrators in one of the death squad leaders in the city of Medan, Indonesia's third or fourth largest city. Back then, third. Now it depends on how you count Bandung. Anyways, a big city, probably bigger than Melbourne. It's as big as Chicago. Anyways, the Anwar Congo was. I found that in Medan, the death squads were recruited from this community of gangsters who hung out in cinemas and loved movies. And so they would propose these dramatizations that were styled after their favorite Hollywood films. And so gradually they produced musical numbers, film noir gangster scenes, cowboy scenes, action scenes, dramatizing their memories of atrocity and their feelings about it. And this evolved organically. Anwar would shoot one simple demonstration, such as you see in the Look of Silence, and then I screened that back to him to see if he would recognize the moral meaning of what he'd done in the footage. And he looked very disturbed. He looks very disturbed. It's an early scene in the film, and you're quite sure he's going to say, we shouldn't be doing this. We shouldn't be. This makes me look bad, but he doesn't, because even to say this makes me look bad and let's stop would be to admit something he's never been forced to admit before, namely that it was bad. And so instead he lies to himself and to me and proposes what he considers to be an improvement, an embellishment, a change in costume, a change in cast, a change in location. And so began this process, this recursive process where we would shoot one scene, he would watch it, and in response to the pain that you could see written all over his face as he would watch his scene, he would propose the next scene. And it would become more and more surreal, more and more desperate attempt to run away from the pain and guilt, and it would become ultimately more and more doomed as the scenes would become more and more preposterous. And so ultimately these scenes become a kind of mirror through which he's, first of all, a prism through which we see the fictions, fantasies, lies, stories that he tells himself and that the perpetrators as a whole tell so they can live with what they've done. And ultimately, though, they become mirrors in which he sees himself and confronts his guilt in some way. And that is perhaps not so surprising, given that actually what was fueling the process for him throughout the making of the film was his conscience, was his running away from the pain that he would encounter at each step in the process. And in the end, I think the director's cut of The Act of Killing, the version that you saw here, isn't even a documentary anymore. It's some kind of it's nonfiction to be sure, but it's a kind of fever dream. And in both films, one look at it is, man, you give people enough rope and they'll hang themselves. Like people say, in the second one, they say the most horrific things, admitting to the most, drinking blood, for instance. And do you think your style and it would work anywhere in the world, and there's a universality to people just wanting to confess, or do you think there was something culturally specific? It's not culturally specific, it's politically specific. It's impunity. And it's impunity in a context where, unlike where the atrocities took place outside of a war, there was no war. When there's a war, there's always two sides representing their case in public, and if there's war crimes, they're exposed by the other side. But when there's no war and there's just mass killing, and when you have all of the victorious powers in the Cold War participating in the mass killing in one way or another, at least aiding it, there's nothing to be ashamed of.
And what's some of the...
And I think that because the perpetrators haven't been removed from power, you see, I think it's tempting to see the boasting as some kind of madness. Or some culturally specific thing. But I think that every perpetrator I filmed, I think we see it in both my films, lives their life actually in manic flight from a kind of pall of guilt and shame that follows them everywhere they go. And maybe they outrun it most of the time. But when they stop to sleep at night, it almost invariably catches up to them and insinuates itself into their dreams and gives them horrific nightmares which wake them. And because they haven't been removed from power, and because they believe the rest of the world not only condones what they did, but actively supported it, they still have available to them a victor's history which celebrates what they've done. And so they do the human thing. If you've betrayed your individual morality by joining a group, allowing yourself to be incited to join a group which has political sanction, political legitimacy, which is doing something you personally feel uncomfortable with, something I think we all have experienced. I think we've all been part of a group which is doing something we're not quite comfortable with, but felt, well, if everyone's doing it, I guess it's okay. I think if you've allowed yourself to do that with something as terrible as killing, mass killing, you and yet you still have available this victor's history justifying what you've done, you would do the human thing, which is to take these bitter, rotten memories of killing and try to sugarcoat them in the sweet language of the victor's history that would treat what you did as heroic. And that's what accounts, of course, for the strange boasting. The low-ranking perpetrators, the ones involved who did the actual killing, are compelled to boast about the most unseemly details of what they've done. Not because they have no morality, on the contrary, because they know it's wrong and because it's the only way they can swallow those bitter memories. They're sugarcoating them. And so this is what I think accounts for the boasting about the most grisly details of what they've done and the insistence upon it.
Now, in the second film, I was interested in, there was a conversation in there where the Islam comes up, and there was about whether the scriptures justify or don't justify. And I was wondering, because you've spent so much time there, and for some reason, if it's Islam in the Middle East, we always think that's a very important part of the story, but less so when we're talking about things like Indonesia. So how did Islam either provide comfort to the killers in some way, and how did it provide comfort to the families of the victims?
Well, the only truly religious people that I've met and where you can see a deep consistency in their religious convictions over their life have been survivors. So Ramli, the brother of Adi, who's murdered in the Look of Silence, he was the sort of imam in his. You wouldn't call it that in his village, but he was more or less the leader of his local mosque. Adi, the main character in the Look of Silence, would do the call to prayer in his mosque, and his parents were deeply religious and take comfort, as you see in the film, from their notion of divine justice in the absence of any justice on earth. The perpetrators were thugs and criminals and ran prostitution rings, smuggled drugs, were hitmen, and before the killings, many of them, and would mock religion openly when they were at the time before the killings and at the time of the killings. Some of them have sought, I think, personal sanctuary from their own guilt in the promise of divine mercy that religion can provide. But I think for the most part, religion has been used as an excuse to justify the killings afterwards. There's been a slander that the victims were atheists who were planning to kill everyone with religion, and a revisionism where you've said that the perpetrators, far from being atheists themselves, were the religious people who would have been killed. So there's this national lie, And that has indeed, over that coupled with the depoliticization, the stigmatization of all genuine political discourse and civic discourse under the Suharto dictatorship, that plus the use of religion to normalize atrocities, to naturalize atrocities, to justify atrocities, has opened the gates in contemporary Indonesia to something that Indonesia didn't have before, which is political Islam in a way that is truly intolerant. But it's not surprising when you recognize that the genesis of that political Islam is an appeal to a false religiosity in order to justify atrocities and crimes against humanity.
What's the most dangerous feedback you've got to your films?
I
guess like most filmmakers just might get like a blogger writing nasty things about them on IMDb, but as soon as you do something as potent as this.
I mean, I get death threats, and I get them, I believe, from the henchmen of the most powerful men exposed in the act of killing. Adi and his family in The Look of Silence have not received death threats, and that's something very important, and of course also a huge relief. It's meant that we haven't.
But why do you think they haven't?
Because I think that the act of killing really humiliated some nationally powerful people. I mean, the current vice president of Indonesia, Yusuf Kala, is in the act of killing, saying we need our gangsters to be able to beat people up and get things done. He's endorsing and pandering to a shadow state that of criminals and paramilitaries and military officers who are above the law. I mean, the Indonesian military, it's important to understand, is above the law. If a military officer in Indonesia orders the massacre of an entire village, they cannot be put on trial in a civil court, in a civilian. They could only be tried if one of two things happen. If a special human rights court is convened by Parliament, something very unlikely because a great many members of Parliament are oligarchs who've bought their position in Parliament. And that's why never before has a human rights court, despite the availability of this legal mechanism, never before has Parliament convened a human rights court for any of the many atrocities and crimes against humanity that have occurred in 1965 and since. And the only other way they could be put on trial is if the military itself were to convene a military tribunal, which means that although we say that the military dictatorship has ended in Indonesia, there still is a military which is formally enjoying a kind of legal immunity, not just for past crimes, but present crimes. And so I do receive those threats. But I wanted to say, in response to your question, that what is the most dangerous feedback that I get? It's not that. It's not the death threats. And the death threats are pretty conditional. They usually take the form of do not come back to Indonesia or else. The most dangerous feedback comes from very often Americans, but people all over the world, who refuse to see the perpetrators through Adi's eyes and refuse to see them as human beings, and in a moment of comforting self-deception, say these men are monsters and have nothing to do with us. It's self-deception because not only I mentioned because the atrocities which go into oil palm production, something that's in our shampoo, our skin cream, our ice cream, our crisps. You know that this is not unique to the production of oil palm. If you look down at yourself for a moment, and at your legs and your arms, and you think of the clothes that are protecting your skin right now and covering you, you know that almost all of it's produced in sweatshops where workers lack basic health and safety protections because they're too afraid or too intimidated to form unions. You know that all of the electronics we're using to run this session are produced in similar ways. And if the men in my film who work now today and their proteges who are goons in Indonesia are monsters, then they're our monsters. They're working for us to create that fear, which is an integral part, an integral part of our global economy, and an integral part of the consumer paradise, or hell, depending on your feelings about it, in which we live. So I think that sense that this is just a window onto a far-off world that has little to do with us and that we'd rather not look at is the most dangerous reaction to the film.
And were you surprised at how literal some critics are? Like generally, 99% of people love the films, but some people are like, well, why are you giving a voice to these monsters? Why aren't you challenging them? When I guess, for me, speaks for itself that it's interesting to see how monsters are human.
Yeah, I mean, Primo Levi, speaking of implicit in my parents telling me that the aim of all politics is to prevent these things from happening again, is of course the notion that they are preventable. And if there are monsters among us, it's very hard to see how it's preventable. Primo Levi, also speaking about the Holocaust, said there may be monsters among us, but they're too few to worry about. What we have to worry about are ordinary people like ourselves. And I think that actually the criticism that you just cited is disingenuous, in the sense that anyone seeing the film can see that these men do not actually glorify themselves. They do not come away, no one has ever watched the act of killing and come away thinking these men are heroic. And of course a platform is something we have a platform right now. We're sitting here talking, we can say whatever we like. And people could throw things at us or mob us, but we can basically say what we like. These men did not have a platform. They were making scenes, if we go back to how I described proposing the project to them, they were making scenes for me, knowing that I had control over how they'd be edited. There was no deception there. It wasn't a trick to get them to open up. They were already open. It was a response to their openness. And the Act of Killing was an attempt to try to understand that openness. And I think the other thing that might have been said along that, it's like giving them a platform, was it's like giving Nazis a platform. I remember one critic said you wouldn't go into Argentina and find aging Nazis and ask them to do this. It would be disgusting. Well, of course you wouldn't. But these men are not hiding out in Argentina. They're heroes, officially. They're seen officially as heroes. And when they die, they'll be given full state honors. And that's why I made this film. It's an expose of impunity today. And I think it's pretty clear from the film. I think that when I say it's disingenuous, that criticism, I think people know that. I think that they actually have trouble overcoming the discomfort that comes with recognizing the perpetrators as human. They find it frightening to think, well, if I grew up in their family in 1950s Indonesia, come 1965, I might have made the same choices. I would hope not. But I'm very lucky never to have to find out. And I think but I think once we can overcome that fear, once we can overcome the fear of accepting this uncomfortable thing about ourselves, then actually we quickly realize this is the only hopeful way of thinking about atrocity. Because if you recognize that if you take all the perpetrators of the Indonesian genocide and you imagine them living in a completely other context, they would be just as nice, just as loving, just as caring, just as capable of empathy as all of the survivors in another context. And once you realize that, you recognize, well, then if we can build societies where we teach our children to practice the widest possible empathy, and we teach them to question authority, we teach our children to question authority rather than to trust what their teachers tell them, what authority tells them, what the state tells them, then we ought to be able to build societies where this kind of unthinkable violence is truly one day unimaginable. And we ought to be able to even build societies where it would be unthinkable, unconscionable for us to live our lives as each and every one of us do, dependent upon the suffering of others. Adi, kalau Adi bisa... Selamat. So, do we have questions for Adi from you, from the audience?
I guess the big opening question is
wait one second. Adi, ada orang yang bisa menerjemahkan pertanyaan untuk kamu? Dan saya menerjemahkan apa jawabanmu ke dalam bahasa Inggris?
Iya, ada.
Okay.
Is why you were happy to get involved in this project in the first place, considering the obvious dangers?
Sedang diterjemahkan atau gimana?
Ya, sebenarnya.
Okay. Mengapa Adi ikut dalam film walaupun ini mungkin ya berbahaya bagi Adi?
Ya,
dari dulu.
Sebetulnya hal ini adalah sesuatu yang
so this is something that I'm not quite sure I got the beginning when it was echoing, but I think he said this is the pain and difficulty and suffering of this goes back for such a long time. And I have and I always hoped, I'm just trying to remember the beginning, sorry, because I was muting. And I always hoped, ya bagian, I remember, maaf. And ever since I was a child, I knew I was hearing the lies taught in school, and I understood because of my brother's experience that these were lies, and my family's experience that these were lies. And I was always hoping that somehow this would be, somebody could write about this could be exposed, the lies could be exposed, or even somebody would one day be able to, one could make a film about this to expose this. But it seemed something utterly impossible to me. There could not, it was something that I imagined, but it was beyond possibility. It was like it could possibly happen. And then so when Joshua turned up, it was a huge surprise for me. It was like what I'd always dreamed of. And so then it was inevitable that I would seize that opportunity.
Waktu itu juga aku berpikiran, wah, ketika Joshua datang, aku merasa.
So when Joshua came, I realized that I would make use of this situation. And in fact, I recently told Joshua, I'm sorry for using you to make this film. But I understood this is the only way that I could systematically and clearly expose what had happened to my brother Romley and to millions of families like mine.
And I guess if anyone, maybe first any questions for Adi, and then later we'll go on for questions for Joshua.
Sekarang.
The question was, Adi, how are your parents now? So my father died in 2012, and my mother's getting older. She's she's now at an age where she's a little unwell. She's unwell and she's a little bit senile. I would just add, though, that saya tambah sedikit Adi tentang Skype bersama antara saya dan Rohani waktu Rohani bersama keluargamu. So I would just add, though, that Rohani, when Adi's father died, Rohani left the village and has been rotating between Adi's siblings, and will spend 3 months with one and then miss another one and ask to move. And she just had 4 months with Adi, and I was Skyping with her every day, and I found her almost sharper than ever. And I think it's because it took so much out of her she was a full-time carer for Adi's father in her 90s. That was difficult, and I think she, at least a few months ago, in the spring, it felt almost as though she was enjoying a kind of Indian summer. It was wonderful, and she was teasing me, and I remember seeing her on Skype and asking, so isn't it strange to see, to see me on Skype when I'm not there? And because she'd never seen Skype before, and she said, "Oh, don't be ridiculous. This is called technology. How are you doing?"
Anyone else have a question for Adi? It doesn't have to be in Indonesian even.
Yeah.
Yes, hand up the back.
Okay, so some months before about 6 months before we had the world premiere of the film, my family moved to another part of the country, and I have not returned to the village and have not returned to the place where we made the film. As a matter of safety.
Oh, safety, yes, I was about to ask.
So I actually feel much better now since since finishing the film. I feel that what was haunting me and of the burden on me has lifted, and I'm able. That this was something very taboo for people to talk about, and for me to talk about, and I feel no longer unable to talk about these things. I feel open about it, and I'm. He said that there's a way in which he felt kind of. I'm blanking. He said that I'm now able to talk about it. That the sense of taboo has lifted, and I'm through the film. I feel that the story has been told, and also I'm able to talk through the film itself, but also through interviews around the film, and the kind of sense of everybody being kind of isolated behind the walls of silence and not being able to talk to each other about these things. That's changed. We're now able to speak. That's certainly a way of not. That's certainly a way of trying to prevent people from hearing the truth and seeing the film and confronting both the horror of what happened, but also more importantly, in the case of The Act of Killing, which is the film you were talking about, also the terrible regime that the perpetrators have built. Now, I should say that the film The Act of Killing was never formally banned. The Justice Minister didn't have the authority to say that the film wasn't being released. He never banned the film, and the film ultimately, once the media started reporting very positively on it, screened thousands of times around the country. By the end of the release of the film in Indonesia, most of the screenings were public, not secret. And we made the film available for free online. If anyone in Indonesia goes to www.theactofkilling.com, or actofkilling.com, not The Act of Killing, you get an option to download the film for free, and it's also there without subtitles for free on YouTube, and has been seen millions, if not maybe even tens of millions of times that way.
Why do you think the media in Indonesia were positive about it?
Well, I think that in a way, some of the credit has to be given to the editor of Tempo magazine, Majalah Tempo, who called me after one of these very early secret screenings and said, "Joshua, I've seen your film yesterday. It has. I've been censoring stories about the mass killings for as long as I've been in this job, and I won't do it anymore because your film shows me above all that I don't want to grow old as a perpetrator. I don't want to grow old like Anwar Congo. And we're going to break our silence about the genocide in a big way, or about the killings. I don't think he used the word genocide. We're going to break our silence about the killings in a big way." And he sent, true to his word, and we're going to show that your film was a repeatable experiment, that it could have been made anywhere in Indonesia. And he sent 60 journalists around the country to look for perpetrators who would boast, often to regions where no one knew whether the killings had happened because no one had documented. No historian, no researcher had ever gone to investigate. And they found that everywhere they went, they could enter a neighborhood, any neighborhood, and ask who was doing the killings here in 1965, and everybody knew because perpetrators had been boasting, as they had in North Sumatra, and they gathered this team of 60 journalists, over 1,000 pages of boastful testimony in 2 weeks. They published 75 pages of it, plus 25 pages about the act of killing in a double edition of Tempo magazine, the most important news magazine in the country. And the lead editorial said, "We have to acknowledge that we live in the Republic of Gangsters." And in one fell swoop, the mainstream media's silence about the genocide ended. The rest of the media started openly reporting on the film, openly reporting on the mass killings. And while, of course, there's some right-wing media that continues to celebrate what happened or justify it as heroic, there was a fundamental change that allowed the screenings to be public. And into that space has come the Look of Silence, which is distributed by two government bodies, the National Human Rights Commission and the Jakarta Arts Council, something unimaginable with the act of killing, which, as I said, began its life in secret. And the first screening was held in the largest, there were billboards around Jakarta announcing the screening. The first screening was held in the largest theater in Indonesia. I think 3,000 people came. The venue could seat only 1,500, so they put on 2 screenings. Adi came to both screenings, and received this 15-minute standing ovation after the screening. It was this idiotic holiday called National Heroes Day. Idiotic because I'm a believer in Oscar Wilde's comment that patriotism is the virtue of the vicious. But on National Heroes Day, trending on Twitter in Indonesia and consequently around the world, because Indonesia is the world's largest Twitter-using country, was, "Today we have a new national hero, and his name is Adi Rukun." A month later, the film came out around the country with 500 screenings on the first day, almost all of them public, and now we're well into the thousands. Oh. Anwar was always kind of propelled, as I described earlier, to propose the next scene that we would shoot with out of these kind of 2 contradictory impulses, I think, to deal with his pain, to talk about his pain, and to find that I could listen to it and I would still see him as a human being. I think that was fundamentally comforting for him, because rather than recoil in horror, I would continue insist upon seeing him as a human being. So that led him to want to share what he did with me and his pain. He opened up about his nightmares. He opened up about his doubts. And when he did that, I was able to open up in return and say, this is giving me nightmares as well. There's a moment, most of you will have seen the uncut act of killing because we're in Australia. And there was a moment in the act of killing where Anwar butchers this teddy bear. And it was one of the most awful things I've ever seen. And while I was filming that, I had Anwar stopped me to say, "Joshua, you're crying." I was behind the camera. And I didn't realize I was crying. I put my hands to my face and saw, I'm crying. It's the only time that's ever happened to me. And Anwar said, "What should we do? Should we stop?" And I said, "No, we must continue." And I really should have stopped then, I think. That was like a straw that broke some camel's back for me. I went home and I had nightmares that night, and it kicked off 8 months of insomnia and nightmares. But ultimately, I was pretty open with Anwar about my own discomfort and horror when I could be. And sometimes I couldn't be because there were other thugs around, other paramilitaries around, politicians around, and it would endanger all of us. When Anwar saw the finished film, so I think he is always motivated by, he was motivated by a need to deal with pain, but he's also running away from pain. And in the moments where he's running away from pain, he's denying the moral meaning of what we're doing, and he's saying, and he says such things as this could, this could go to Hollywood, or this could win a prize in a film festival, and wouldn't that be wonderful? And Anwar, in the end, I think that ultimately, maybe the best description of Anwar's, of how I negotiated that was not to give him, I certainly didn't give him any editorial control over the film, but I did show him the finished film. And he was very moved by it. He watched the film. At the end of the film, he sat there. He was tearful, and he was silent for what felt like an eternity, but it was probably 5 minutes. And then he said, I asked him, "How do you feel?" And he said, "This film shows what it's like to be me." And I asked again, "How do you feel?" And he said, "I'm relieved to have been able to show what these events have meant, and not merely what I've done." Yet again, to talk about what I've done. And Anwar and I remain in touch, not as often as we used to, maybe every couple months now, every 2 or 3 months. And we care about each other a lot. And that relationship is one of the things, it's maybe not one of the biggest things, but one of the things that I'm proud of in my life, actually.
Yeah, well, that seems like a good place to wrap up. I had one final micro question, which is, have you seen The Emperor's Naked Army Marches On, that documentary?
Yeah, how many of you have seen that or know that film by a show of hands?
It's called, I said that sort of so you knew if you like, this is my opinion, if you like these 2 films, there's a film, another filmmaker called The Emperor's Naked Army Marches On. And
have you seen that, any of you? So it's worth describing briefly. It's by Kazuo Hara, and it's about it's about a veteran of the Japanese war in the Pacific, I think in Papua New Guinea, and he goes and he confronts his commanding officers who abandoned the troops to such a degree that was cannibalizing the troops because they were so hungry, and he confronts them. It's amazing. He confronts them out of anger, and he beats them up on camera, some of them. And I talked earlier about this overall safe space of making a film, and within that, creating spaces where you can sort of rub reality. You can create occasions where you rub reality against the grain. I honestly rewatched the film recently because I was in a dialogue with him. And I have to say, I could never film that or make that film. I couldn't film people beating each other up.
Or if you don't mind watching people getting beaten up, then it's it's sort of, I only asked that question, so if you like this, I was being that Amazon.com, if you like this, you'll like that. And anyway, thank you very much. I
don't know, and my answer is I don't know if you'll. I hope that they're not necessarily linked in that way.
Thank you very much, Adi, for your time.
Terima kasih banyak, Adi.